good. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone to part 7 of the ISCN, AGU, and USDA Climate Hub hosted webinar series on soil carbon and climate. In part 7, we will address the question, how much carbon sequestration can organic amendments achieve? It's a much anticipated topic. I'm excited to hear about it. Just briefly to introduce myself, I'm Eric Slesarev. I'm a postdoc at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and I'm the Soil Health Coordinator for the International Soil Carbon Network, or the ISCN. Today we'll have 2 speakers joining us. From California, we'll have Dr. Rebecca Ryals, who is an assistant professor at University of California, Merced. Her research focuses on ecosystem-based climate solutions, and a major research theme that she pursues is the capture, transformation, and beneficial use of organic wastes. Second, we'll have Dr. David Powlson from the UK. He's currently a visiting professor at the University of Reading and at Southwest University in China. He's an emeritus and former head of the soil science department at Rothamsted Research, where he spent his career focused on the study of organic matter cycling in agricultural systems, leveraging the long-term agricultural experiments that make Rothamsted so special. So just a bit about the structure of this webinar, in case you haven't been attending one of them before. We have 2 20-minute talks, followed by time for questions. Some of the questions were submitted during registration, and I'll be posing some of those, but you're also free to pose questions via the questions function, which you'll find in your GoToWebinar control panel. So you can enter a question via text that way, and then I'll select some of those questions and relay them to the speakers. We'll have 2 blocks for questions, one after the first talk and one after the second. And finally, I think I ought to mention, since this is the last soil carbon webinar of the season, so to speak, that if you are attending the AGU conference, either in person or virtually, there will be a recap of this whole webinar series at the ISCN Town Hall, which is midday. I think it starts at 12:15 New Orleans time on Thursday, December 16th. So tune into that. And stay tuned for next year. We're planning another series of webinars on this topic to dig into some of the more fundamental and cross-cutting issues related to soil carbon and its role in climate mitigation and adaptation. All right, without further ado, let's hear from our first speaker, Dr. Rebecca Ryals. Take it away, Becca.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you all so much for attending. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this amazing seminar series. My name is Becca Ryals. I'm an assistant professor at UC Merced. I'd like to acknowledge that our campus sits on the ancestral and present-day homelands of the Yakuts and the Miwok. So this question is a very exciting one. To me, it's one that I think a lot about in my research and also with the farmers and other practitioners that I work with. It's a very complicated question, even though it seems like it should be pretty simple. So today I want to talk about getting us all on the same page. What are organic amendments? How much are out there? Why would we apply them to soils? And then get a little bit in depth into a case study where we're looking at how compost amendments to rangelands has changed soil carbon sequestration capacity. And then I want to follow up with just a few bits of case studies where we can think about other important considerations regarding the methodologies that we use to quantify soil carbon, especially when it comes to organic matter amendments, thinking about different boundary perspectives, systems and life cycle perspective, and then coupling soil carbon with other goals like sustainable development. So there are both bottom-up and top-down motivations for organic amendments, for the use of organic amendments. From the perspective of a farmer or a rancher, they might be interested in using organic amendments because they provide a source of plant nutrients These nutrients are complexed with organic matter, and they contain both macro and micronutrients. They tend to be a slow release of those nutrients, and so they're a kind of a sustained source of available plant nutrients. And this is important for a farmer who might be interested in organic certification, or who's interested in reducing their use of synthetic fertilizers or improving soil health. From the top down, there's additional motivations as well. Some of them have always existed, and some of them are more recent. So for example, organic matter amendments and the return of organic resources to soils plays an important role in circular economies, rethinking our society at large and how we reduce waste, and really rethink how we use the nutrients and the organic material that's embedded in wasted organics as a resource. It can also help with our management decisions that we make in terms of a hierarchical decision tree for how to handle, to treat, and reuse or dispose of organic wastes. There are also top-down approaches in terms of policies and market and goals that are set for climate change. Just a couple examples here. On the top is a map of current state-level soil health policies that are either passed or in the process of being developed. All but 9 states in the US have some activity in terms of soil health. Many of those provide either technical assistance or financial incentives for soil carbon storage, and some of those include organic amendments in particular. There's also a new USDA NRCS conservation standard practice that's focused particularly on soil carbon amendments that provides funding through EQIP for farmers to get financial incentives for applying these kinds of amendments with the goal of increasing carbon. There are also large fluxes of wasted organic residues because a lot of our society is linear based, and we produce a lot of waste. When it's acting as waste, it often becomes a liability, a source of pollution or environmental health consequences. And these fluxes are quite large. Just a few examples are shown here. The global flux of human and animal feces is about 4.6 petagrams per year. Petagram is 1 billion tons. This is a resource that's going to keep being present year after year, and there's many ways that we can manage and potentially recycle and reuse those residues for soil carbon storage. Wasted food is also a major issue. There's almost 1 petagram per year of wasted food. That represents about 30% of our global food production system. So there's a need to prevent that waste, but also to capture some of that and recycle it back to the soil. There's also wood residues that could be used for organic amendments in agricultural systems or urban environments that can also help with fire prevention and forest management. For example, in my backyard here in the Sierra, we have a number of years of drought that's resulted in massive tree mortality, and there's a need to bring that fuel out of the forest, and that wood material can be used potentially for soil carbon. So organic residues, there are many different kinds of organic residues. They all have their embodied nutrient profile, chemical characteristics, biology in them. Those organic residues can be treated in different ways, from simple storage over time to physical, chemical, or biological processes that treat that and transform it into something that we would call an amendment. That can include pyrolysis, or the production of biochar, composting, or anaerobic digestion, or a number of other treatment practices within that. So then once we have our amendments, we have really a range of different kinds of amendments. So when we're talking about organic amendments, we're really talking about a complex gradient of organic residues that have very different properties. 2 properties that I'm showing here is the gradient of nutrient availability and carbon concentration. So we can think of some organic amendments like manure that hasn't undergone a lot of treatment that tends to have high nutrient availability, but relatively low carbon concentration. On the other end of the spectrum, we have materials like biochar, which is produced from pyrolysis or gasification. there's a relatively low pool of available nutrients in that amendment, but really high carbon concentration. So when a practitioner, a farmer is choosing to use organic amendments, they have a suite of values that they have and goals that they have on their land, and they might be balancing both the needs for nutrient availability and the need for more persistent carbon. The amendments also affect how carbon is stored in the soil because of their application rate. Amendments can be surface applied, they can be tilled in, they can be injected into deeper layers. All of those will affect the fate of that material and the impact on carbon uptake of that ecosystem. So there's a whole complex suite of factors based on the amendment type, the rate, frequency, and method of application, and also the soil system that that material is being applied to, which really complicates that big question that we have at the beginning of the talk. Things that are tend to be important across studies are things like soil texture and mineralogy, climate, baseline soil carbon conditions, feedbacks among plants and microbes, as well as time and other management factors. So how do organic amendments contribute to carbon sequestration, despite this variation in the kinds of amendments and the systems that they're used in? Well, we can think about it in two ways. Organic amendments have carbon in them. They are made of a lot of carbon. And so we can think about that carbon that's applied to a soil system and has some residence time there. If that residence time is much longer than an alternative fate used in another system, that could result in at least short-term carbon sequestration. But the caveat here is that our soils that we know are dynamic ecosystems. Much of the carbon that we put on in amendments is not going to just hang out there. It's going to interact with the soil biology, chemistry of the soil, the mineralogy, and it's going to change and it's going to decompose over time. So when we're thinking from a climate perspective, the more complex but more interesting question is really, what are the indirect effects of organic amendments? How do these organic amendments indirectly change carbon storage by altering the capacity of plants to take up carbon through photosynthesis, store it in protected pools, and lose it through microbial respiration or dissolved organic carbon? And if we're thinking from a climate perspective, as we saw in an earlier webinar, it's also really important to consider other greenhouse gases that are emitted from the soil. So the particular case study that I'll highlight here is the Marine Carbon Project. This was a project that was started in 2008, and we have data, intensive data over the first 4 years of the study, and then a 10-year sampling time point. These plots are still set up. They're protected for the long term, so we anticipate data coming in the future as well. So the Marine Carbon Project is a project where we applied a one-time application of compost at a 1/2-inch surface application. We did this at 2 annual grassland systems, one in the coastal grasslands of California, one in the valley grasslands. We collected a whole wide range of ecosystem responses from that one-time application. The data I'll show here today are focused on soil carbon. We collected that carbon to a 1 meter depth at different depth increments. And I should also note that this study, originally done at 2 sites, has now been replicated at 17 sites through the Marine Carbon Project across California, and through the Healthy Soils Initiative has incentivized demonstration projects that are not technically part of the Marine Carbon Project, but retain some of the same elements. So in the next few years, we should see even more data that, at least in this region, that really intensively replicates this in space. And so the bit of data here that I'm showing is that a one-time application of compost increased plant growth rates. The first 5 years of the study are shown at the beginning, and then this point out here is our 10-year time point. We saw increases in plant growth. These are systems that have really high interannual variability in terms of rainfall. And so we do see some extreme drought years that we saw in 2012 and 2013 where the response was not significant. But at the 10-year time point, we do still see an increase in plant growth rate after that one-time application of compost. And anecdotally, also each year we go out there, we actually see greening up happening faster and staying longer during our growing season. That response of above and below ground net primary production has contributed to changes in soil carbon that's been measurable over time as well. Here I'm showing the relative change in soil carbon stocks as a function of the composted plots minus the control. So anything above the 0 line indicates more carbon in the composted plots. Anything below means there's more carbon in the control plots. And these two bars are different depth increments, 0 to 10 and 10 to 30. We did sample down to 1 meter. I'm not showing that data because there's no significant difference beyond the 30 centimeters so far. And so a couple things to note is that we saw an immediate and sustained increase in carbon in the 0 to 10 centimeter depth. Again, these were surface applied, so we expected to see that. And that was attributed to an increase in net primary production. And then what's really interesting at our, one thing here. We also, in addition to bulk soil carbon, we also looked at carbon fractionations at the 4-year time point. And at this 4-year time point in that 0 to 10 centimeter surface soils, we saw that nearly half of that new carbon that was in that system was found in these physically protected pools. So that's an indication of medium to long-term protection of that carbon. What's really interesting is after 10 years, we see sustained increases in the 0 to 10 centimeter soil carbon pool, but also we now see a switch. We actually had some pre-treatment differences where the control soils had more carbon, but now we see that the composted plots have actually increased the amount of soil carbon in the 10 to 30 centimeter depth as well, even though this material is surface applied. So over time, we might start to see the influence of soil carbon at depth playing an important role. If we combine both of these depths, we see that the soil carbon has increased by 8.8 megagrams of carbon per hectare over these 10 years. That's just a little bit shy of 1 megagram of carbon per hectare. These are really exciting results. That's a pretty substantive number, especially considering the vast amount of grazed grasslands there are in California and throughout the world. As I mentioned, the Marine Carbon Project has now been replicated in Dr. Silver's lab at 17 different sites throughout California to really try to test this across different bioclimatic conditions, at least that are contained within the state of California. And so far, over the first few years of the study, we see pretty similar rates of change in soil carbon storage. We can also think about this outside of the boundaries of California or even the Marine Carbon Project. There's a great study, a meta-analysis that came out by Kelly Graveyard and others a couple years ago, where they looked at the effects of organic amendments in rangelands, looking at not just compost, but a wide range of organic amendments and rangelands that are present in the literature, not just in California. And one finding they had was that the increase in soil carbon was remarkably consistent. There was, out of the 240 something studies that they were able to include in this meta-analysis, about 233 of those showed significant positive log response ratios. So this appears to be a practice that's robust across many different kinds of contexts, at least for within a 10-year time frame. So now I want to build on that and think about some other considerations when we answer this question across different contexts. And this is these are thoughts that I've had over many different projects that are ongoing in my lab and in others' labs that I see emerging as important for how we move the field forward. One aspect to consider is how we sample and report our carbon sequestration results. The case study I'll use here is work that we've done on fields that have been amended with biosolids for 20 years. We've measured soil carbon to 1 meter depth across these 3 different ecosystems in California, and in some of the cases measured significant increases. And we expected to see most of the increase happening in that surface soil, at least the top 30 centimeters. But here I'm showing data from carbon fractionation of the samples from 0 to 10 centimeters, 30 to 50 centimeters, and 75 to 100 centimeters. And we do see an increase in the free light fraction at the surface soils, but very interestingly, at the deeper depths, we see an increase across all three fractions. So this shows us that we can't just restrict our sampling to that surface soil, even if we think the management is directly impacting that, because again, these systems are dynamic, soil's changing, not just in the surface soil, but along that soil profile. And so if we're not measuring that, we're not capturing that. And I should note, this can go in either direction. In this case, there was a positive increase at depth, but in other systems like tillage systems, we actually see some decreases in lower depths that balance out the increases that are shown at the surface soils. So it's really important to consider the depths that we sample from. And we also need to consider how we represent these data. Those of you who are biogeochemists or ecosystem ecologists are probably used to using process-based models like DACENT. DACENT has been used to build Comet Farm, which is a planning tool that's used to predict or project changes in soil carbon with compost application and a number of other carbon farming practices. Those process-based models consider site conditions. Those models still need to be improved as we collect more and more data, but they are pretty good. Another way that people are trying to build the use of organic matter amendments into decision support tools is to try to use a unit of megagrams of carbon stored per the amount of application of that amendment. This provides a much simpler carbon calculator, but it's not really, it doesn't capture any of the site context, which is very important. So in this case, across the sites that we sampled from, we can express changes in soil carbon based on the depth that we're looking at. And again, we see differences if we're only considering the 30 centimeter depth of the 1 meter depth. But when we see variability, that variability is attributed to site and management differences. When we try to express it as a unit of amount of amendment applied, we see huge differences. It's not the case that 1 megagram of biosolids applied at Sacramento provides the same outcome in terms of carbon storage as the same megagram of carbon biosolids applied in another site. You can see these are several orders of magnitude different. So we really need to think about building easy support decision tools, but also ones that are grounded in the site specifics. Another point that I want to make is that this life cycle and systems perspective is really important to consider as well. Work that we have going on right now that's very exciting is looking at how we combine different organic amendments to really maximize the impacts both in terms of soil carbon, but also in terms of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. So this is just a snippet of that data showing when we co-compost dairy manure with biochar, we get way more than an additive improvement in reducing climate change emissions, both in terms of reducing methane from the compost pile, but also by increasing soil carbon capacity from the contribution of both the compost and the biochar, and the complex nature of those two materials treated in the same way. And lastly, I think it's also important to say that we need research in many areas of the world. There's systems that are overrepresented in the literature, and oftentimes our most vulnerable or degraded systems are not captured in these studies. One example is the work that we're doing in Haiti on ecological sanitation. Haiti is a region that's one of the most climate vulnerable in the world, and also has experienced extensive environmental degradation as a result of the impacts of colonization on that country and on those people. We're working with an organization called Soil that's composting human feces to sanitize waste, but also provide an organic amendment for soils that can be used for food production. And just some preliminary data that we have from a greenhouse experiment shows that applying compost results in a sustained increase in crop production over many cropping cycles, and that results in an increase in soil carbon that we don't see with some of the other fertilizer mechanisms. So in summary, there's a lot to talk about at this. I welcome follow-up emails, and I'm excited for this conversation. But just to make the point that organic amendments is not one thing, it's a whole suite of material that comes from different feedstocks, different treatment, and different application processes applied in very different contexts. So the context matters very much when we're trying to project the impact of an organic amendment on soil carbon benefits and other co-benefits or trade-offs as well. But the studies that we've seen so far, and there's more and more coming out every day, is that organic amendments appear to be an example of a viable and scalable strategy for sequestering carbon in the soil. And with that, I think that is my time.
Thank you. All right, well, we have a bit of time to pose some questions here, so why don't we dive into that? I have a question. As the host, I can throw my question in first, which relates to the point you made at the start about direct versus indirect effects of amendments, and the direct effects depending on the resident's time in an alternative scenario. And so I'm curious to hear how we know those alternative scenarios and how critical it is to model them when we do the accounting.
Yeah, really good question. So I think that, this gets again to that like life cycle and systems perspective, thinking not just in your field scale, even though that might be where you're focusing your concentration of the mechanisms and the measurements, but really pulling that out and how does it fit into the larger context. Honestly, most of the time I try to take a conservative approach to that question, because what you don't want to do is oversell the potential, and climate we're at an emergency right now, and so we want to make sure that we're having the best strategies out there. So I do think it's important when we have a lot of uncertainty to take the most conservative approach to that. So in most of the projects that I work with, the carbon accounting that we do hardly ever accounts for that direct carbon. We just kind of assume it's there and it's going to decay. These materials are biogenic, so oftentimes when we think about accounting for carbon that are biogenic sources, those are fast cycling. So on the time scale of climate change, that's just fast cycling between biological components back to the atmosphere. Where it might differ is things like biochar, which can have a really, really long residence time. And so that treatment of, like, let's say you have a woody material that if you have wood chips that are applied to a soil, that might decay over several years. And so, that's relatively fast cycling. But if you have those same wood chips and then they undergo pyrolysis and are transformed into biochar, you may have a much longer decay rate for that material than it would be if it was wood chips applied to that soil. So I think that there's a need to refine that, especially when we're thinking about biochar as an organic amendment and how to account for that direct and indirect component, and how to include that in models in a way that's conservative, but also grounded in some good empirical data. I think we need more good empirical data for that, but it is hard to have long-term studies on these things. I'm excited to hear from David because we have few experiments in the world that really give us 100+ years of data, which is what we need to answer some of those hard questions.
Great answer, thanks. Okay, we've actually someone has raised their hand. Usually people submit questions via text, but this is exciting because usually people don't do this. So Mark Waldrop has a question. Hannah, if you can help me here by giving him speaking power, that would be great. Otherwise, I will try to figure out how to do it.
Yep, so I have taken him off mute. He should be able to click the microphone button and say his question.
Right. Fire away, Mark.
You're kind of putting me on the spot. I think I was playing around with how to raise my hand and take my hand down. So But I can still come up with a question. So how scalable is this? I mean, as a real solution to climate change, we're looking at a maximum of 10 megagrams per hectare. I'm trying to understand how many, you need, I'm just calculating, this is a billion hectares to get up to a petagram. I'm just wondering how scalable is it, and how do you see the future of this this work in terms of land management strategy?
Yeah, great question. Scalability is key. One really good reference I'll point you to is Wendy Silver and Allegra Meyer's paper. They coupled these field-based measurements with global climate models to get at what, if these were done at a large scale, how that would actually cool the planet. And they come up with some really exciting numbers for that. It's complicated because it also depends on how much fossil fuel emissions we have. If we reduce more fossil fuel emissions, the gains that we get from cooling the planet through these practices are actually bigger. If we're continuing at really high rates of fossil fuel emissions, those gains become lower relative to the Earth's climate. So they are scalable, and in that climate model that they used, they took very conservative approaches in their estimates for how much land area is available. I can't remember those numbers off the top of my head, but I recommend checking out that paper. So that's one thing to point to. And then the other thing to say in this is that I think there are a lot of global fluxes of wasted organic material that we don't tap into. I mean, the work that I'm doing with ecological sanitation shows the potential for reusing human feces. Of course, people have been using this for as long as people have been around, but this is a very different context than kind of human manure that was used many centuries ago. And so thinking about how we capture those kinds of waste streams that right now are either going directly into the environment or going to landfills where they're causing massive problems. I think those are untapped resources that we don't have, that we don't really usually account for in these calculations. So that's another thing to consider. And then the other thing to consider is the need for good policy and market drivers to provide those incentives. If it's cheaper and easier to send organic material to the landfill, then it's not going to be returned to the soil, and that won't be a scalable solution. So we need more than just the science. We need more than just the accounting and the technical potential of that carbon. We need societal structures that incentivize farmers to use the right kind of organic amendment that's suitable for their needs, all things considered, not just carbon. And so, some examples of that are the Healthy Soils program in California that incentivizes the use of organic material for carbon, and coupled with a state law that we have now that's effectively banning the disposal of organic material in landfills. So when you change big structural things like that and really get to those mechanisms that promote that more circular economy, then I think it becomes more and more scalable. From a technical potential, I think it's there. I think the barriers are a little bit more in, providing a cost-effective, feasible way for farmers to use these material, providing other infrastructure to capture it and treat it in ways that don't produce harm and produce the most benefits. So I guess that doesn't give you a number in terms of scalability, but I think the potential is a lot bigger than we can imagine.
Great, thanks Becca, and thanks Mark for posing that question when you were put on the hot spot right there. I think we should move on now to our second speaker. Sorry, we got kind of a late start earlier on, but we still have time. So we will have Dr. David Powlson now, who's joining us from the UK and has some very exciting stories to share about the long term, something we're all curious about. David, if you can queue up the PowerPoint, then we'll be ready to go.
David, you're on mute if you're speaking.
Oh yeah, I think let's see. We can unmute.
And we're also seeing your email, not your PowerPoint slides.
Okay, right. Can you see my PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Okay, right. Hello, well, hello everybody. Thank you for, it's great to be with you, and thank you the organisers for inviting me, and hello from the UK. I was asked to talk about the Rothamsted long-term experiments and soil carbon. I'm just saying I've got the sort of box on my screen. Is that, are other people seeing that? The sort of, oh, I've done something wrong there.
Looks good to me.
Oh, okay. I've lost my slides. I can't see them now.
So we're still seeing your slides, David.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Right. Fine. Okay. Right. I'll carry on. Well, thank you. Right. Well, I'm going to put up this slide, which is what I nearly always use these days. What I'm saying is that soil organic matter, which is about 50% carbon, can be looked at through two different lenses. One is what I call the soil health or soil quality lens, which is all to do with how the soil is functioning. It's how the physical, chemical and biological properties of soil are affected by organic matter. And this, of course, influences the way that crops grow. And the other lens is the global carbon cycle lens, which affects climate change. And of course, as Becca has said really already, the world's soils contain an awful lot of carbon. They're estimated to contain something like 1,500 petagrams or gigatons of carbon, which is about twice the amount as the carbon in the CO2 in the atmosphere, and some estimates are even bigger than that. So if we can increase that soil carbon stock, get more carbon from the atmosphere into the soil through photosynthesis, through plants, we can slow carbon, that's carbon sequestration, or if it goes the other way, which sadly it often is, if we release extra carbon from the soil, we're making climate change worse. And of course, agriculture is a source of two important other greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide. Now, just a slide about each of those lenses. For the soil health and soil quality, it's the flow of carbon through the soil that's important. This is because that gives the energy for the microbes that do most of the things that we want. Pretty much always more carbon is better, a few small exceptions to that. And also small increases in soil carbon can be very beneficial for soil properties. I'll come back to that later. I think it's important to say that increased soil carbon does not guarantee increased crop yields, but there's lots of other benefits anyway, which I've put there in the sort of blue boxes. For example, the year-to-year yield stability can be greater in a higher carbon soil. So that's a sort of a buffer against adverse weather, better water retention, decreased fertilizer requirement because you're getting some nutrients from the organic matter. And so that's saving some greenhouse gas emissions anyway. And so overall, more sustainable system. For climate change mitigation, there's got to be an additional transfer of carbon from atmosphere to soil. And Becca alluded to that. Not just a redistribution of carbon that was in the soil or in the landscape already. We'll come back to that point later. It's got to be an increase in the absolute stock of carbon in the soil. In order to get stock values, such as megagrams of carbon per hectare, you need to have bulk density measurements, not just % carbon in the soil. And these are not always so easy to get accurately. And also, if we're looking at sequestering carbon, remember soil carbon does not increase indefinitely, and the highest rate of accumulation is in the early years. So you've got to watch out for those sort of things. We'll come back to those points later. Right, the Rothamsted long-term experiments. I mean, people like me have been so privileged to work somewhere where we've been bequeathed these experiments that were started well over 100 years ago. So for example, on the top left there, the Broadbalk winter wheat experiment started in 1843. So it's been going for over 170 years now. Initially, it was long plots, more than 300 meters long, growing winter wheat every year. Over the years, those plots have been divided up, as we tend to do, and some of the wheat is still grown every year, but some is grown in a rotation, and some of the treatments have been changed as well. On the right there, you've got the Hoosefield spring barley experiment, which is started about 10 years later. Fortunately, our forefathers had the foresight to archive samples. Crop samples have been archived virtually every year. Soils not so often, but we've got them there. And there's some of the very old bottles at the bottom left there. And the next picture, the more boring picture, is what the archive looks like now. Two important people here. My colleague Andy McDonald is the manager of our long-term experiments at the moment, and Margaret Glendinning, I think she'd probably call her the curator of the data. She's responsible for this digital setup called ERA, Electronic Rothamsted Archive, and that web link you see there. If you go to that, you can get a lot of information about our experiments and some very useful summaries of data. So a few just basic points about soil organic carbon. So soil carbon is the amount of carbon in a soil is a balance between inputs and outputs. If you convert land from natural vegetation to cropland, you'll virtually always get a loss of carbon. Once you're in a cropping system, it's actually quite difficult to increase soil carbon by large amounts. As I said, a small increase can have a big effect on soil functions. The other points I think I've said already. So here's some data from this very old Broadwalk experiment, so in 1843. So we're plotting here on the y-axis the quantity of organic carbon in the soil in megagrams and tons per hectare, using the archive samples, but of course the samples now been analysed by modern methods. You can see that the bottom line, the one marked unmanured plot, no fertiliser, no manure added, has been bumping along at a low level of what, about 25 tons of carbon per hectare, not going down. The reason it's not gone down over this long time is that this site was cleared of the natural vegetation hundreds of years ago. We have a map from 300 years before it started showing this as an arable field, and the main clearing in this area happened in even pre-Roman times, going back almost 2,000 years. Where manure has been applied at a high rate every year, soil carbon has gone up, and we're now at about 2.5 times the amount of carbon in the no manure plots. The points are actual measurements here. The line is a simulation from the Ross-C model. Then a new manure treatment was started later, so we've got a replicate of that. And quite significantly, you'll see the NPK treatment given inorganic fertilizers at a sort of moderately sensible rate, so much higher yields than in the unmanured plot. Its soil carbon has gone up a little bit. You can measure it quite easily, slight increase there. This is in contrast to claims that were made by a couple of papers, or more than 10 years ago now, based on a misinterpretation, sadly, of results from the Morrow plots at Illinois. But then Ladder et al. Did a review of over 100 long-term experiments worldwide and found the same trend that we see. Inorganic fertilizers give you a bigger crop, which put slightly bigger residues back in the soil, in roots and what I call stubble. Often I think it's called stover on your side of the Atlantic. So that's quite important. Right, I said that good news for soil health is that even a small increase in soil carbon can be good for soil properties. I'll illustrate that by a review we did, gosh, 10 years ago, of some straw incorporation experiments from temperate regions, both from mostly Europe and some from North America. What we found was, first of all, as you'd expect, where straw was retained rather than taken away, there was a trend for soil carbon to be a bit higher than where the straw was taken away. But that trend was pretty small. It was only statistically significant in about a quarter of the experiments. But in some of these 25 experiments, the scientists had measured either microbial biomass carbon, that's the quantity of carbon held in the cells of living organisms, or other so-called active fractions within the total. And these changed proportionately much more than total carbon. So they can actually be useful in detecting changes. And then thirdly, in some of the experiments, scientists had measured soil physical properties, specifically aggregate stability or penetrometer resistance. And there were evidence that some cases, these had improved even when you could barely measure a change in total soil carbon. Now, another way of getting more organic carbon into an basically arable soil is to grow arable crops in a rotation with pasture. We're in the UK, we often call this a lay arable rotation, and we have some of these. Here's one at Rothamsted. This particular field was in fact under grass for a long time, until about 1949, at which point it was ploughed up, and a large part of the experiment went into a rotation with a few years of grass and then some years of arable crops. We've got a little bit of the original grass left, and we also was set up, not we, my forebears, 1959, set up an area of bare fallow soil with absolutely no carbon inputs going in at all. So obviously this has given us some very contrasting soils, and we can, the good thing about having these experiments is that we can apply all sorts of new techniques to them. These experiments are not museum exhibits, they're things that I call them living laboratories, so we can apply new techniques as they come along. And here's an example of using X-ray computed tomography to look at soil pore structure. And this was done on both soil cores and on individual aggregates at a finer scale, looking at the fallow soil that's been very low organic carbon content, the arable a bit higher, and the very old grassland soil, much higher carbon content. And the green parts here represent pores in the soil. Now, okay, the fallow one has got some huge cracks in it that show up, but apart from that, the number of pores in this low organic carbon soil are much less than, say, in the grassland, the higher organic carbon one. And the same group of people, colleagues of mine at Rothamsted and a group at Nottingham University, where they do the imaging, could interpret those that sort of data to look at the amount of connected pores, not just individual ones, but how good are the connections between these soil pores. And you can see here in the low organic matter, bare fallow soil, they're not very connected, but in the high organic matter grassland one, they're very connected. And this is important because connected porosity has a big effect on hydraulic conductivity. So that's the ability with which water can move through the soil and gases, and the ability for roots to penetrate the soil. So we can use these old experiments in new ways. Right, now let's talk about sequestering carbon in croplands to mitigate climate change. What I always say now in talks that I give on this is, it's not as easy as you think. Now, if I go back 25 or 30 years, when I was a much younger person, back to the 1980s and early 90s, I was quite excited about the possibilities for climate change mitigation by sequestering carbon. Now, at that time, though, it was perceived by our political masters that there was overproduction of food, and we could take land out of production. In the European Union, we had something called the set-aside scheme, and in the USA, you had the CRP, Conservation Reserve Program. So you could take some land out of arable, convert it to woodland or grassland, and that's great for sequestering carbon. But now we're in a different world. We're concerned about global food security, how to grow enough food for the 7.5 billion people in the world. It won't be very long before it's more like 10 billion. Concerned about the Sustainable Development Goals. We really have quite limited scope for removing land from agriculture. So we've got to focus on what can we do within land that continues in agriculture. And this is where we've got limitations. So here's a nice diagram just to illustrate carbon sequestration. Here's about our approximately 750 and now a bit more gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere, about twice that in the soil. The question is, we want to try and get some of that atmospheric carbon into the soil. We'll get there via plants, via photosynthesis. Now, this is where I think I get a bit controversial here. I think some of the papers published now on this topic are really quite seriously confused in the terminology they use. I think I'm concerned about how much carbon can we sequester in soils that carry on growing food, the food that we need in agriculture. But and I've already said that, yeah, you can take some land out of agriculture. That's good for sequestration, but you don't grow food on it. but I think there's quite limited areas for that, some, but not a lot. But another big issue is avoiding carbon losses, avoiding deforestation, avoiding ploughing of natural grasslands, particularly avoiding drainage of peatlands. So these things are all going on, as you well know, all over the world. And some of the people who have been writing papers about the potential for sequestration lump these things together. And they include avoided carbon losses with actual sequestration in agriculture. If you lump them all together, you've got a big number because there's huge scope to avoid carbon losses. But then people then think, oh, we can sequester a lot within agriculture, and that's not logical. So let's think about some of the ways in which we can increase organic carbon in croplands. And all of these are good for soil health. So they're all good, but the question is, which ones actually represent carbon sequestration for climate change mitigation, and what are the barriers to that? Well, first of all, I'll just tell you something about manure. Now, manure is a very good way of increasing soil organic carbon, but it's mostly used somewhere, not necessarily efficiently. There's plenty of scope for using it better. But let's have a look at this. Here's some manure, and here's some fields near where I live. If we put that manure on this field, soil carbon will go up in it, just like we saw on the Broadbork experiment, rapidly at first, but then sort of leveling off. But what would happen if we'd not put the manure on that field? It wouldn't have disappeared, it would still be there. We'd probably put it on another field, perhaps that one there, and its soil carbon would have gone up. So with the manure, there's no additional carbon transfer from the atmosphere. If we've got animals producing manure by eating grass or other plant material, that manure has been produced already. That carbon has come from the atmosphere already. So if we do an experiment where manure is shown to increase soil carbon, we're actually not putting extra carbon from atmosphere to soil. We're moving it from one place to another. Of course, it's good for soil quality, and of course, it decreases the need for chemical fertilizer. So it's all good, but it's not actually slowing climate change directly. We've already talked about adding straw or crop residues to soil, as I did earlier, but another way of getting extra carbon into soil is to have a rotation, a grass or a pasture and arable rotation. I mentioned the one earlier. Here's another one on a sandy soil that some of my colleagues have looked at in great detail. And this table shows you some changes in organic carbon over a 35-year period, and it's expressed in this parts per thousand per year notation, which we'll come to in a moment, in plough layer soil. And I absolutely agree that one really needs to look at deeper soil as well. And that's been done to some extent here. In the continuous arable treatment here, soil carbon didn't change much over that 35-year. That -2 parts per thousand is not significantly different from zero. When we look at the rotations that have 3 years of pasture and then 2 years of arable, there's a little bit of a trend in a good direction, but actually it's still very small. In fact, all 3 of those are not significantly different from zero. If we go to long lay periods, 8 years of pasture, then plough it up and have 2 years of arable, then we do start getting some much bigger rates of organic carbon change. But now we're in a different system. We're only growing grain crops or arable crops in 2 years out of 10. So that's obviously got big implications for food production if that's done on a big scale. So here is a list of practices on the left there, which all of which are good for increasing soil organic carbon. So they're all good practices to have, whatever else about them. Then I've put here in the middle column, are they actually taking extra carbon from the atmosphere and putting it into the soil, and therefore slowing climate change? So cover crops, well, yes, they are, because there's extra photosynthesis going on there if you've got those where soil would otherwise be bare. It doesn't fit into every cropping system. If you've got a series of autumn sown crops, as we often do in Western Europe, then you can't do it much, but if you can, it's good. If crop residues are returned, yeah, that's mitigating climate change. Depends what else you did with those residues. In some parts of the world, they can still be burned, so better to do this than burn them. But the increases in soil carbon are quite small, And a barrier is that in many cases, farmers want to use that straw, usually for animal bedding or animal food. I've already talked about manure. This is really a spatial redistribution of carbon. Zero tillage is a complex one, and I've given this a yes, but. The biggest effect of zero tillage is to redistribute carbon with depth, putting more of it near the soil surface. But over time, there is a net accumulation in the whole profile. So that has a positive effect, but there are limitations. I understand that many farmers who do zero tillage actually do a periodic ploughing just to overcome either weed or compaction problems. You do that, you lose a lot of the benefit in terms of carbon. These rotations with pasture in them, again, yeah, they are, I think, genuinely sequestering carbon, but you're growing less arable crops, so there's wider implications there. Intercropping, yes, again, I mean, I've seen quite a lot in Africa where you've got maize being grown, corn being grown at quite a wide, 50 centimetre spacing, and then perhaps beans being grown in the space between. So that's extra photosynthesis going on, so that is bringing extra carbon into the soil, as well as potentially another crop for the farmer, if there's enough water. It depends on rainfall. And I think agroforestry has got a lot going for it, and I think more needs to be done on that. Lots of benefits, I think, but it's a big change of practice for the farmer, so it's not something that can be done overnight necessarily. Right, some cautions about sequestration. Many of you will know about the 4 per mil initiative that started at the COP conference in Paris in 2016, I think, 15. What they say in this initiative is, if we increase by 4 parts per thousand, 4 per mil, 0.4% each year, the quantity of carbon contained in soils, then we could halt the annual increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. This is a big claim. That would require between 7 and 9 gigatons of carbon to be sequestered annually. There's been a lot of criticism of this, so that the initiative is claiming far too much. Now, if you read the papers about this initiative carefully, you'll see that actually the goal is now being scaled back. It's not 7 to 9, it's a bit over 1 gigaton, although I think they've done it rather obliquely. And also these papers say, oh, don't take that number too seriously. It's an aspirational number. Now, I think that if you've got an initiative with a number in it, to my mind, that's rather tricky wording. But anyway, it pushes in the right direction. And of course, any increase in soil carbon is good for soil health. There are some papers, very well-known one from Bill Schlesinger and Ronald Amundsen in the US, saying, let's get realistic, let's claim too much. And we analysed our long-term experiments and said that there are major limitations to achieving that rate of soil carbon increase. I've alluded to some of them already. So, to conclude, some final thoughts. Increasing soil carbon is always good for agricultural sustainability and for most environmental impacts of soils within the ecosystems. Within ongoing agriculture, it's very sensible to adopt what I call carbon-friendly practices. It's always going to be good for the functioning and the sustainability and the quality of the soil. But let's recognise the limitations for climate change mitigation. Is it genuine transfer of carbon from the atmosphere? There are practical barriers. It's reversible. If you, let's say, go to zero tillage but stop doing it, you lose the carbon you built up. The initial rates of carbon are often quite fast. Carbon accumulation are often fast, but then they tail off to almost nothing later on. So don't be fooled by very high rates measured in the first few years. And also you need nitrogen and phosphorus to go with that carbon that's locked up. I think equally important, at least as important in my view, is to maintain the areas that have big carbon stocks. Let's stop deforestation. Let's stop drainage of peatlands. And this is where the COP type conferences and the IPCC process comes in. Not gone far enough, but we sure need to be pushing that further. Where feasible, remove unproductive areas from arable cropping and convert to natural, semi-natural vegetation. You can do that, but the areas are limited and you've got to be careful of leakage. If you do it in one place, somewhere else, somebody might chop some trees down to make up the loss of production. And finally, I often say for carbon, think nitrogen, because nitrogen fertilizer use and nitrogen from manures and legumes can lead to emissions of nitrous oxide, greenhouse gas that's nearly 300 times more powerful than CO2. So anything we can do to use nitrogen more efficiently, whether it's from fertilizer or other sources, is got to be good for climate change. And again, I think we should be focusing more on that and not only being narrowly focused on soil carbon. So that's where I stop. And here's somebody sampling some soil on one of our experiments a few years before I was born. I wasn't there, fortunately. So thank you.
All right, thank you, David. What a terrific overview. So we're actually a little over time now. I don't think we'll be cut off, but we don't have too much time for questions. Let me see if there are any in the list here. Well, just for the sake of completeness here, maybe I'll pose one question before we close out for the day. So I think one theme that you identified is that there are effects on soil health and function which are separate from effects on carbon sequestration. So I'm wondering, how can organic amendments specifically contribute to climate adaptation as opposed to mitigation?
Yeah, well, I think they most certainly can, because if you've got a better, basically, if you've got a better physically structured soil, then the soil is going to work better in the ecosystem. Soil will, for example, rainfall will be absorbed better, so it's going to be stored for the crops rather than run off if you've got a poorly physically structured soil. Also, that helps flood risk as well. We have a lot of problems now in this country where we get more intense rainfall, even leading to flash floods, which is something rather new for us. You've got a better structured soil, you'll get less of that. But of course, also, if you've got more organic matter in your soil from organic inputs, you'll have more biological activity, which often will give you protection against root diseases as well, if you've got a more flourishing biota in the soil. So those are a couple of ways in which you can get climate adaptation, I think.
Thanks. Okay, well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and we're a bit over time now, so I think we'll close it there. But thank you very much, David and Becca, for joining us today and sharing these two terrific presentations. I think we got some great scope in the material we covered. And just as a reminder, these we do record and post these videos, so they'll be available on the ISCN website for anyone that's interested in using them as a resource in the future. I look forward to potentially seeing some of you either in person or virtually at AGU at the ISCN Town Hall. And of course, join us next year. We'll have another series of webinars waiting. Thank you all. And that's that.